week, I started a little two-part mini-series on the book of Habakkuk, and even though it's a short book, even splitting it into just two parts is, doing a lot of condensing and overview. So if you need further depth, you may need to do a little more follow-up yourself. I'll do a little review here, a brief review. Habakkuk his ministry was probably during the time of Josiah. Now, there's some room for debate. Some think it might have been a little earlier during Manasseh, who was a very wicked king. Some suggest maybe later, but probably, during the time of Josiah, who was a very godly king, very godly man, zealous for the Lord. But the fact is that it was also a time of major upheaval. Judah is in decline. It's on its way to becoming, as I put it last week, a vassal state where pagan nations like Egypt and Babylon would dictate who's king, and they'd have to pay tribute. And what's more, it's a time when wickedness is prevailing, and that's how the whole book starts out. The book of Habakkuk is written as kind of a conversation with God. Habakkuk speaks, then the Lord speaks, then Habakkuk again, and the Lord. So you have to keep straight who's talking, who's speaking here in this. And it's a time when, he's crying out because of all the wickedness that's going on. And then he says, how long do I cry out, Lord? And it doesn't seem like you're listening. Nothing's happening. It seems like things are going worse. And so there's an element of frustration or whatever. And Habakkuk is written I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but it's written in a very emotional and poetic style. And it's of a man it's like he's wrestling with the Lord. He's got serious problems and things questions he's presenting to the Lord. And there's still greater turmoil just around the corner. Whenever the time of his message, just a matter of really not that many years, and Judah is on its way into 3 stages of captivity and destruction. So there's some real upheaval going on within the nation, and if you will, on the international scene, with Egypt and Assyria being defeated, and now Babylon's the dominant power. And, just like they face a lot of turmoil both in their nation and abroad, there's a lot of turmoil going on in our nation today, isn't there? A lot of upheaval going abroad. We could spend a whole lot of time just covering all the events of what's going on in the newspapers. So in that regard, I think it's timely. He's crying out about all the wickedness, as I mentioned. And the Lord says, yeah, I'm going to deal with that wickedness. And he says, here's my instrument. I'm going to use Babylon. I'm going to use this nation. They're raising up. They're very powerful. They're just devastating. They mock at any nation that stands up against them. I'm going to use them to deal with that wickedness and idolatry of Judah. And Habakkuk has a problem with that. He's wrestling with the Lord on that. Now, wait a minute, the Lord? You're a just and holy God. Now, yeah, Judah's got lots of sin and wickedness, but Babylon is no better. In fact, they're worse, or at least in his eyes, they're worse. How can you use a nation that's even more wicked and corrupt to deal with your people? How can you look on that? But in the midst of his questions, he determines, I'm going to wait on the Lord. I'm going to listen for him. And one of the things he hears at the beginning of chapter 2, verse 4, it says, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by faith. And that's a verse that gets quoted a couple times in the New Testament and becomes a cornerstone of the Protestant Reformation. It's a key verse for our salvation. We aren't saved because of how good we are. We aren't saved by how much we go to church or how many religious things we do. We're saved by one thing, and that's by the grace of God, by putting our trust in him, not in anybody or anything else. But even in that time and that day, the Lord's saying, you've got to put your faith in the unseen, in one who is unseen, in a Lord who is unseen. Put your trust in an eternal one who reigns from eternity. So that's where we're going to pick up here. I'm going to start with basically chapter 2 pretty much the rest of chapter 2 is God's message saying, I guess you might say, in a sense, you're right, Habakkuk. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I haven't done a study whether I'm putting the right emphasis on the correct syllable, but that's how I pronounce his name. But in a sense, the Lord says, you're right, Babylon is a wicked nation, and judgment is coming for it too. That's in essence what chapter 2 is about. God, the righteous judge, will not be mocked. He uses the wicked, but he also still judges them. So that's picking up. This isn't going to be a total verse by verse because I've got to do some condensing here just to cover 3 chapters in 2 sections, but we're going to briefly go through a little bit here. Starting in verse 4 of Habakkuk. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol. He's like death, never satisfied. He gathers himself to all the nations and collects himself to all peoples. Will not those who take up the taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his? For how long, and makes himself rich with loans? Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you've looted many nations. All the remainder of you peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples. So you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. I'll stop there, but we'll pick up in a little bit, but I'll make a few comments. Again, this chapter, although it doesn't expressly refer to Babylon or the Chaldeans, the Lord's basically talking about really any wickedness, but it includes Babylon. It too will stand. There's a day of reckoning for Babylon. And he talks about how basically the tool used by the Lord, the tool that God's going to use to execute his judgment on his own people, is not going to escape God's own judgment. He ultimately reigns supreme over all. And he condemns Babylon in verses 5 as well as in 15 and 16, which we'll get to. He condemns their drunkenness and carnality and just excessiveness of physical pleasure and the things of this world. References there to debt and usury, the imagery of those who are increasing their wealth by debt. And you either look on that either as usury, which in the Old Testament was condemned, at least as far as to a fellow Jew. You were not to charge interest when you gave a loan to a Jew. You could to a Gentile, but and that was condemned under the Old Testament. But also the imagery here is like somebody who's getting wealthy by taking what is not his own, like somebody who's trying to get wealthy by taking out lots of debt, borrowing money that isn't yours. And that's an imagery of Babylon. It became a very powerful and wealthy nation. But from the time when Daniel was taken into captivity in the first captivity, it only lasted about 70 years, which in historical context is a tick on the clock. It became a very wealthy and powerful land. But it got there through a lot of savagery and taking what was not it, what did not properly belong to them. And it talks about bloodshed and violence. In verse 12, it talks about, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that the peoples toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? But then in the middle of all this, verse 14, hits one of the key notes of chapter 2. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. When God brings his judgment, he reveals his glory. He reveals who is the ultimate Lord, who is the ultimate King, who's the one who has the final say. He's the one who determines it all. And it talks about building a city with bloodshed, and frankly, I tremble for our nation. As I mentioned last week, given a little bit of the historical backdrop, King Manasseh, who preceded Josiah, it says he filled Jerusalem with blood. And here it talks about Babylon being a very bloody nation. And then I stop and I think, did Manasseh kill 55 babies? 55 million, I should say, 55, 56, whatever the number is now, the number of abortions in our land. It's a trembling thing if we stop and think about it. God's day of reckoning. Is there a reckoning apart from his mercy that we need to cry out about? Chapter 15, or verse 15 rather, talks about, woe to you who make your neighbors drunk, who mix your venom even to make them drunk, to look on their nakedness. You'll be filled with disgrace rather than honor. You drink yourself and expose your own nakedness. The cup of the Lord's right hand will come around you, and utter disgrace will come on you. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the towns. And again, it's just depicting how Babylon became powerful, but it also was a very carnal, wicked, full of all kinds of immorality and self-indulgence. Again, if we want to stop and think a minute, does that have any application to us today? That's a sobering thing when we want to get frank and ask the Lord, where do we stand in that balance apart from his mercy? And then verse 18 says, what profit is the idol when the maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork. When he fashions speechless idols, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a dumb stone, arise. That is your teacher. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there's no breath at all inside it. Again, talking about idolatry. It was full of all kinds of idolatry. Here in America, maybe we aren't carving images so far, although I don't think we're that far from it anymore. Maybe we aren't making stone images that we're bowing down to, but don't we have plenty of idolatry in our land? Or we're worshiping the almighty dollar, pleasure, convenience, videos. Are we bowing in worship to our smartphone? I mean, seriously. Seriously. Now, I'm not preaching against smartphones. I just got a smartphone, so this isn't anybody who gets a smartphone is in sin, but do we own it or does it own us? And there is a very real issue with a lot of modern technology that's drawing us, in essence, to a form of worship that's not right. And just the whole issues that are going on in trusting in something and desiring something more than the Lord. But then chapter 2 ends with this. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. A couple key verses from chapter 2. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And the Lord is in his holy temple. All the earth is going to be silent before him. There is, in the midst of all the wickedness, all the corruption, all the foment, all the torment, all the upheaval and turmoil that's going on, there is a king who rules over it all. And he will reveal his glory, and ultimately all of us will be before him, and basically all nations will be speechless. Every politician, every king, every prime minister's mouth will be shut, unable to respond to the true King of all, to the Lord of all. So there's a day of reckoning that's coming for all men and all nations, and God will manifest his glory throughout all the earth one day, even if we don't see it in our day. in our lifetime, God will manifest his glory to the whole earth. With that, I want to move on to chapter 3. And chapter 3, it's basically Habakkuk's prayer. The rest of this book now is Habakkuk, basically in prayer. And it's a kind of a poetic psalm. It refers to the very first verse, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to Shigidionoth, or however you pronounce that one. My margin says it's a highly emotional, poetic form. And so, again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this is it's a prayer written as a poem, and it's written as a passionate expression of what he's coming to see and what the Lord's about to do. And I think an important part of this is that it's an intercession as well. It's an intercession for the Lord to show his mercy to his people in the midst of judgment. It's going to be a picture of God's execution of justice, but yet also redemption for his people. And I love the verse, chapter 3, verse 1, or chapter 2, or verse 2, excuse me. I've heard the report about you and I fear. It's important for us when we come to the Lord to come to him in reverence. Now, it doesn't mean a fear in terms of being afraid to come to him. The Bible tells us we can come boldly to the throne of grace. We can come with confidence. He's a gracious and merciful God. But we also need to come with reverence. And there is a certain theme that's going on, I think, in the church today we're getting a little too familiar with God at times. It's like he's our buddy. So, sometimes it's reflected in certain songs, I love a lot of contemporary songs that have come out over the years, but there's some that it's like we're reducing the Lord to a level that's not appropriate. He is our Father. He is our Papa. We can address him as Abba, Daddy. He's also God, the Father, Lord, and ruler of all earth. And it's important for us to have a willingness to come to him in humility and in prayer. And he goes on to say, Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of years, make that known. That's at least how it says in the New American Standard. And so what's that mean? It's an interesting poetic expression. But one way of looking at it is he's praying, Lord, in the midst of adversity, may you renew your people. Even in the hardship, even in the hard times, renew us, renew your people. And another way of viewing it is as the years and as the centuries pass, God's going to reveal his work in his people and his nations. In the ebb and flow of wars, of persecution, of suffering, of all that happens in this world, God's story is coming forth through his story. History is what his story, as some have put it. He's the ultimate Lord. He's going to reveal his work in his people. Chapter 3, verse 2, I love Habakkuk's prayer. In wrath, remember mercy. That's a good thing to pray, and it's an appropriate thing for us to pray. When God revealed himself to Moses, and Moses said, well, show me your glory, and the Lord says, well, I can't show you my face because no man can live if I show you my face, but I'll let you see a glimpse of my back. And when the angel of the Lord came passing by, what was the first thing that was proclaimed? Was it a God of judgment? And it's the Lord full of loving kindness. He desires to show mercy to his people. So we can pour out our heart to him. Even when we're facing hard times in our own personal life, in our land, in the world around us, whatever level we're talking about, in our home or anywhere else, we can pour out our heart. We can be honest with God. And even in those times when God is doing hard things, when it seems like his judgment is coming on wickedness, Even when his own people have fallen into sin, we can still cry out for mercy. We can still turn to him and look to him for his mercy. And for that matter, we can cry out that even as the Lord judges the wicked, he can still show mercy to his own. Doesn't mean it's all going to be fun and games, doesn't mean it's all going to be easy, but he can still show his mercy and his provision to the godly. Again, it doesn't always come the way we think it will or should. I think of the story of the hiding place that I know you all are familiar with. Greenleaf again did that recently. Did God show his mercy to Corrie ten Boom, to Betsy ten Boom, to the ten Boom family? Yeah, but didn't come easily, and some of it was marked with death, wasn't it, for several of them? So God's mercy may not always come packaged the way we'd like to have it come packaged, but we can still cry for his mercy, even in those times. We need to move on here. Starting in verse 3 of chapter 3, read 3 through 7. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. Ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress, and the tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. Verses 3 through 7 basically painting a picture of the Lord suddenly coming. It's a picture of he's suddenly appearing and startling the nations. Jesus said that he's going to come at a time when no man knows, no man sees. He's going to come unexpectedly like a thief in the night. There is that time of sudden judgment, and not only in terms of the second coming, but, judgment suddenly came for Babylon, literally overnight. The nation fell. When God executes his judgment, even in this time, sometimes it can come in a very sudden and unexpected way. And the arrogant and the wicked tremble before him. Suddenly there's that day of reckoning when those who mocked the Lord, who rebelled against him, are suddenly faced with a reality. And there's that day when no one expects it, when all will see him, and he will scrutinize all. He will study the very innermost hearts and motives and attitudes, not just what we did, but why we did it. And he judges it all. Pick up at verse 8 now. Did the Lord rage against the rivers? Or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea, that you did ride on horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers, the mountains saw you and quaked, the downpour of waters swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice, it lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their places, they went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth, in anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. You pierced his own spears, the head of his throngs. They stormed to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You tread on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. Again, it's a very poetic imagery, but basically what Habakkuk is doing, he's painting a picture of the Lord pouring out his wrath on wickedness. And the picture that's painted is it's like the Lord has appeared in a chariot and just riding furiously on the waters of the earth. And my way of putting it, just like this tidal wave, a tsunami of justice, if you will, that's being painted here. He is a merciful God, but he is also a God who will not be mocked, and he does bring judgment. He does make it right in the end, as Jeff has said many times. There is a day when God makes it right in the end. And there's a picture of the Lord who's furious, who's bringing his day of reckoning to those who will not bend the knee to him, who will rebel against him, who stand against him. And creation itself will tremble before him. He's using apocalyptic imagery, the sun and the moon standing still, and mountains trembling and quaking, and rivers being torn apart, and so on. It's a picture that the Lord who made all things will use all things for his own purposes, his own glory, in his own way. And that includes the physical earth. However that all comes together, I don't know, but he does indeed rule over it all. When the Lord tramples the nations and judges the earth, he's going to go for salvation of his people, for the salvation of his anointed. That's what it says in verse 13. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. When God brings justice, he also brings vindication for his people. He makes it right. He reveals those who truly are his. He reveals those who stand for him. Again, we may not always see it in our lifetime, but he does stand. And his judgment is also ultimately to bring vindication for the godly. And he will reveal his redemption in the midst of judgment. That's kind of a twofold thing we don't see. You know, come back to the day of the cross. What did the disciples see? Their Lord hanging on a cross, being brutally beaten, then nailed to a horrible way of execution. Was it a day of judgment? It was a day when God poured vicariously his judgment for sin upon Jesus, for the whole world. But was it also a day of redemption? Disciples didn't see it right then. Later on they would, when the Lord was risen and so on, but when God brings his judgment, he also brings redemption for those who turn to him in faith. So I'll move on here now to the last part of chapter 3, and that's Habakkuk's final prayer here. And he's trembling. Starting in verse 16, it says, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound of my lips quivered, decay enters my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us.